This lecture, we're going to talk about cross-region replication. You've done CRR in either the Developer Associate or the Solutions Architect Associate. If you still don't remember how to do it, just go in and create an S3 bucket and turn on cross-region replication. It will basically tell you all the things that you need to do. This is just a high-level overview of what you need to understand going into your exam for the Certified Security Specialty. So obviously, cross-region replicates objects from one region to another. The key thing to understand is that by default, this is done using SSL. So you do not need to create a bucket policy or IAM policies to turn this feature on. When you're doing it from one region to another, it's always done using SSL. So unlike in the last lecture where we wanted to force our users to use HTTPS using a bucket policy, and we use that Boolean feature, which was AWS Secure Transport, you do not need to do this for cross-region replication. It's doing it automatically. It's encrypting it in transit. And we'll cover encryption at rest in a second. Encryption at rest is a bit interesting, but by default, encryption at transit is done using SSL. Now, bear in mind that currently the way cross-region replication works is you can replicate objects from a source bucket to only one destination bucket. So you can't have like a bucket going to one bucket, then off to another bucket. It's not like read replicas with RDS. It's literally a one-to-one relationship. Who knows if that will change in 2018 though? We'll just wait and see. But currently it's just from one source bucket to one destination bucket. And after Amazon S3 replicates an object, the object cannot be replicated again, at least not using cross-region replication. Of course, you can engineer your way around this. You could use things like Lambda. You could have a trigger on your destination bucket, and then you could actually get Lambda to go ahead and replicate that to other buckets. There are definitely ways to do that if you want. Now, in terms of the requirements for cross-region replication, you probably remember this from the associate course, but the source and destination buckets must always have versioning turned on. The source and destination buckets must be in different AWS regions. It is called cross-region replication for a reason. And Amazon S3 must have permission to replicate objects from that source bucket to the destination bucket on your behalf. And when you go in and create this for the first time, it will create a role for you, and that role will assign it's actually a customer managed policy. They'll create the policy for you, but it's not an AWS managed policy, it's a customer managed policy. And again, you can go in and turn on CRR on your own environment and then go in and have a look at that policy inside that role. Now, if the source bucket owner also owns the object, the bucket owner has full permissions to replicate the object. If not, the object owner must grant the bucket owner the read and read ACP permissions via the object ACL. So that's a really important thing to understand, that basically, if the source owner bucket also owns the object, then they have full permissions to replicate it. However, if somebody else owns the object, then you have to use object ACLs in order to replicate that object from one bucket to another. So bear that in mind going into your exam. Cross-region replication does work across accounts, and you're going to be tested on that. The IAM role must have permissions to replicate the object in the destination bucket. So you are going to need to turn on, both cross-region replication, and you're going to need to set up a role that has access to the destination bucket. And in the replication configuration, you can optionally direct Amazon S3 to change the ownership of the object replicas to the actual AWS account that owns the destination bucket. And a good use case for this is basically if you're doing all your CloudTrail auditing. So you go in and turn on CloudTrail, and we are going to cover CloudTrail later on in the course. What a lot of people will do is have CloudTrail log everything to an S3 bucket inside that AWS account. You then turn on cross-region replication, and it will then replicate those audit logs to another AWS account. And it literally only has the permission to replicate that, and that's it. It has no permission to go in and delete those objects, has no permission to go in and even read those objects. It's literally a black hole that you send your logs to. And that is AWS's standard, that's their basically standard architecture for the most secure way in securing your CloudTrail logs. So do remember that going into your exam. It's always best practice to have a separate AWS account. You turn on cross-region replication, you have your CloudTrail logs replicated to the second AWS account, and you can only replicate. You can't go in and write, you can't go in and read those logs, and you can't go in and delete those logs. So that is something to bear in mind. Again, we'll cover this off in the CloudTrail section of the course. So what is replicated? Well, any new objects created after you add replication configuration. So if you have an existing bucket and you turn on cross-region replication and it's already got some objects in there, those objects won't automatically be replicated, but any object that you add after that will be replicated. So obviously cross-region replication is going to replicate your unencrypted objects. It's also going to replicate your encrypted objects. Now the documentation here is actually quite interesting. It seems to sort of contradict itself. So Amazon S3 replicates objects encrypted using the S3 managed keys. So this is when you basically upload to S3 and you say, I want to encrypt the object using AES 256. Basically, AWS will just use the S3 key to encrypt that. That's fine. It also does do it using the AWS KMS managed keys, but not by default. You actually have to go in and turn that on, and we'll cover that off in the next slide. So yes, it does replicate encrypted objects, mostly by default just using the AWS S3 managed key, so SSE S3. It can do it using the AWS KMS key, but you have to turn that on. It's not done by default. It also replicates the object metadata, any object access control list updates, any object tags, and then Amazon S3 replicates only objects in the source bucket for which the bucket owner has the permissions to read the objects and read access control lists. So you have to make sure that your owner for the source bucket definitely has the permissions to read the objects and read access control lists. If not, then you have to go in and basically enable that using object ACLs. In terms of deletes, this is really important. So if you just use a delete marker, then that delete marker is replicated from one bucket to another. So if you go in and delete an object, essentially all you're ever doing is placing a delete marker over that object. That delete marker is then replicated to the to the other bucket, but all the underlying versions are still there, both in the source bucket and in the destination bucket. So in terms of what is not replicated, well, anything created before cross-region replication is turned on, which I just covered. Objects created with server-side encryption using customer-provided encryption keys, so SSEC, is not going to be replicated. Objects created with server-side encryption using the AWS KMS keys, unless you explicitly enable this option. And that's where I talked about the documentation sort of conflicts with itself. It says that SSE KMS is replicated, and then it goes on to say, well, actually it's not unless you explicitly enable the option. So you have to go in and explicitly enable it. And then objects in the source bucket for which the bucket owner does not have permissions. So this can happen when the object owner is different from the bucket owner. So you have to go in and obviously play around with the object's ACLs and make sure that they have the permissions to read that object so that it can be replicated across to the source, to the destination bucket. And then deletes to a particular version of an object. So as you can remember from the associate courses, we can actually go in and delete specific versions of a file. Now, cross-region replication will not replicate that delete to the other bucket, and this is a security mechanism. So it stops people going in and maliciously deleting versions of a file that won't be deleted on the destination bucket. Delete markers will be replicated from one to another, but of course delete marker is just hiding the file using versioning. It never actually goes in and deletes it, and then if you want to restore a file, you just go in and delete the delete marker. So that is really key to understand going into your exam. Check out these links. We will link to them in the resources section in this lecture. Go have a read through that. But like I said, the real important thing to remember is that, first of all, you do not need to use a bucket policy with AWS Secure Transport to replicate objects using SSL. The replication is always done using SSL by default. Do remember that. The only time you're going to use this AWS Secure Transport is inside a bucket policy is to basically make sure that nobody can access that just using HTTP. They must access all objects in that bucket using HTTPS. Delete markers are replicated, whereas deleted versions of files are not, so do remember that. Versioning must always be enabled both on the source and destination bucket in order for cross-region replication to work. And remember that it is possible to use cross-region replication from one AWS account to another, but the IAM role must have permissions to replicate objects in the destination bucket. And this is often a security best practice. So you might get some scenarios in your security exam, and it's all around where to store the CloudTrail logs. Best practice, you're always going to store CloudTrail logs in the same S3 or in the same account as where CloudTrail is turned on. But best practice is to turn on cross-region replication and then replicate those logs to another AWS account that only the auditors have access to, and that this account can't go in and read or do any deletes. It literally has only the option to write to that account, and that account basically becomes a black hole. So you send all your logs to that black hole. You then can't see what's inside that black hole. You can't access it, whereas the auditors have a complete copy of the CloudTrail logs. And of course, CloudTrail logs every single API call that you make in the AWS console. So if somebody goes in and provisions an EC2 instance that starts mining Bitcoin, you'll be able to see not only who did that, but at what time they did that and for how long that that service was running, etc., etc. So that is cross-region replication in a nutshell. If you have forgotten how to do it in the console, just go ahead and play around. I assume you've already learnt it in the associate courses. It is pretty simple. The main things you need to remember is what is on your screen right now. So that is it for this lecture, guys. In the next lecture, we're going to look at how we can lock down S3 using CloudFront. So how can we basically make sure people always use the CloudFront URL rather than an S3 URL. If you already know how to do that, I have covered that off in the associate level courses, but it is a popular exam topic in this exam. Then go ahead and skip that lecture. But if you just want a quick refresher, go ahead and watch it. So if you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.